In this video, we're going to talk about the input manager. So I did mention it a bit in previous videos, but we haven't actually seen it yet. So currently, if we go into our player controller, we have now used the input class and we've used .getAccess. So there is a lot more that we can do with the input class. And I'm just going to show you some demonstrations here quick. So we can use input, and then another really common one we can use is GetKey. And now we have three options here. We have GetKey, GetKey down, and GetKey up. So if we select it, it does give us a brief explanation of what it does. But the quick, simple explanation of each of these three different ones is GetKey is going to return true every frame that you're pressing that key. Now GetKey down, what that's going to do is it's only going to return true the first time you press it. So the single frame that you press that key, that's where it's going to return true, and the rest it'll be false. And then GetKey up is the opposite. So it'll only return true on the frame where you let go of the key. Now to use these, we can just select GetKey. Now we just have to use our brackets. And now inside here, we have to tell it what key we want. So the way you do that is you use key code dot, and then this is where we have every key from the keyboard. So say if we wanted to check for the user pressing the space key, we could use keycode.space. And now if we look at this line of code, this actually does nothing here. But I mentioned this is going to return true or false. So we could put this into a bool variable. So we could do bool, and we could do something like has key been pressed. And we'll set that to equal this statement. Okay, so now what we're going to do is every time an update, it's going to take this has key been pressed Boolean variable, and it's going to check if Input.GetKey keycode space has been pressed. And since we're using GetKey, this is going to check every frame like I mentioned. So let's just test this out. Let's do debug.log and let's output has key been pressed. So now when I run this, right now it's saying false because I'm not pressing space. And then as soon as I press space, I'm holding it down, so you see it's constantly going up. I let go, it stops. I press it again, it's constantly going. And we see the number. So that's 5,900 times that it ran when it was pressed. Now if we change the same thing to GetKey down, so I'm running this and it's false the whole time. I press it and I'm still holding, but it only says 1. I let go, still 1. Press it again, 2. So you see it only registers the very first press. Okay, and then I can just show up quick as well. So same thing. Okay, so I just pressed it. I'm holding it right now. I let go, 3. So that's 3 different ways we can check for a key press. Now we talked about this a bit earlier. I don't want to make it too confusing when you start. But if you start noticing that since Input.GetKey up returns true or false, and we're putting it into a variable that stores true or false, that's kind of redundant. So we can just use this writing in an if statement, or in this case, writing the debug. So if I go here, let's delete that. Actually, let's just delete this whole line. Now write in debug.log. I can just do Input.GetKey keycode .space. And now when I run this code, it's going to be the exact same thing. So now I press space, and it's true. So you definitely can put that into a Boolean variable first if you want to have a variable name that. But just make sure you know that this does return true or false, so you can skip that whole step if you prefer. Okay, so that's how you get a key press. But the downside to that is you have no control over that. So if I do something like, let's do an if statement here. I'm going to do if Input.GetKey down, and then we'll do keycode.space. And then we'll just do a message here, you know, let's just say fire button was pressed. So if this was like a shooting game, we would treat space as our fire button. But now if we wanted to change controls at some point in our game, where all of a sudden we'd want to say, you know what, maybe I want to use the space key for something else, not for the fire button, we would have to go through our code and make manual changes to this anywhere there. And it would get really repetitive and confusing. You might mistakenly change some code and not others. So we don't want to have to manually do that. Unity has something built in called the Input Manager. And we've already started using it with getAccess. This horizontal here, this is getting a value from our Input Manager. So if we go up to the Edit menu, and then Project Settings. Now in here, we're going to see one called the Input Manager. So let's click on this tab here. And now it is mentioning that there's a new input system. That's fine. That's something you are going to probably want to explore in the future. But for now, we're going to learn how to use this one first. So if we click this little arrow next to Axis, this is all the default ones that Unity has built in. So if we look back at our code, before we did Input.GetAccess horizontal. So if we look in the Input Manager here, we have one called horizontal. This is what we access when we use that line of code. So if I click the little arrow here, you can see we have a name, and this can be changed to anything we want. You can have a description in here as well. And this is where we actually configure the buttons. So if we look how I told you on the last videos where we set up the getAccess, that we could press either the arrow keys, the WASD key, or even a gamepad analog stick. That's what we're looking at here. So negative button is going to be the button that goes to a negative value, which remember, if we pressed left or the A key, it would go to -1. And then positive is to the right, which would be a +1 value. So in here, left is a sign, which is the left arrow, right is the right arrow. Then the alternate negative and positive buttons is the A or the D key. And then we have a few other options here. So we have gravity. What gravity is when you're using something like an analog stick, if you press it to the left and you let go, it's going to move back to the center. So right in the center of that controller, and it's going to go back to a 0 value or very close to 0. Gravity controls how fast that value changes when you let go. And if you mouse over it, you can see it describes it here. It says speed in seconds that the output value falls towards neutral. Now, dead zone works fairly similar. It's working with an analog control, but this determines how close it has to be to the center to be considered not in use. Okay, and then we can also control the sensitivity of how fast it responds when we press it. So we have lots of options in here, and we do even have one to invert the controls. So that could be used for something like a flight simulator where sometimes you have the controls reversed. Okay? And then we have type, so you can set like key or mouse button. We can also set for mouse movement, for joystick. So we have lots of options here. And then the axis, we have all these different ones we can take from a joystick. So this is something like on an Xbox controller where you have multiple different analog sticks and triggers. You can actually Google or check the Unity docs, and they can tell you which one of these lines up to each button on each controller. So we have a lot of options here. We're not going to cover any of that at this point here. We just want to know how to use the Input Manager. Okay, so we talked about this horizontal one, and to access this, we used Input.GetAccess. Now, not all of these are the same. So if we want to look, remember when we started moving, we used left to right controls. This horizontal input has a range that you can press. So it's going from -1 to 1. Now that's something like a direction, an analog stick, arrow keys on your keyboard because you're moving. But when you want just a simple button press, that's different. So if you're pressing the space key, there is no left or right or how long it takes to press, things like that. It's either you pressed it or you didn't. It's just a simple button. For that, let's look at, we have one built in here called jump. So since we're going to want to make a jump for our player, let's look at this one. Now notice we have the name jump. Positive button is the space key. Then we have these different settings here. We're not going to change any of those. The defaults are great. Okay, so we have all those, but if we scroll down, we see another jump. So let's expand this one. And if we look at this one, it's very similar, except this one has joystick button 3. So this means we have 2 jumps in here. Both of them are going to get called when you try to use them, and it's going to check for all of those options. So we could have space key on the keyboard or the button 3 on a gamepad do the exact same thing in our game. And to the player, it's going to be seamless. So the benefit to this is we can set up multiple different buttons or controllers that the user can use, and we can check for all of them at once without having to do multiple if statements. So at this point in the course, I don't want to change anything in here. I just wanted you to see this. As well, you could look at the different options here. So if you wanted the first button on a gamepad, you could use fire 1. And then if we scroll up here, we see another fire 1. So we could see, okay, so if I look, by default, this means left control or joystick button 0 is the fire button. So we don't have to go in and customize anything. Now to access this, let's say we want to use fire 1. As we mentioned, is joystick 0 or left control. Let's close out of here. Let's go back. And now instead of input.getAccess, we want to do input.GetButton. And now if we look at this, notice we have 3 different options here, just like we did with GetKey. So we have GetButton, GetButton down, or GetButton up. These work in the exact same way. So GetButton is going to return true every frame. So let's just do that one for right now. And now in the brackets, just like we did with GetKey, we have to put what we want in here. Instead of using the key code, we use this string from the input manager. So in this case, it was fire 1. Now the thing here, we have to make sure this is spelt exactly the same because it is a string. So what I would usually recommend doing is copy and paste it from here for whichever one you want. So, I mean, these ones are pretty simple and straightforward, but if you start putting complex names in here, you want to definitely copy them. And then notice if we use jump, we have to use a capital J. So let's just debug this out. So debug.log. Now let's go to our game. And notice I did just turn on my Xbox controller. So I'm going to use the gamepad as well. Okay, so I'm in the game here. When I left click with the mouse, notice it's going up now. So mouse button, the left click is considered fire 1. Then left control I'm holding now. So left control is going. I let go, it goes back to false. And now I'm pressing the fire button on the gamepad on the Xbox controller. And it's going true again. So I can use 3 different devices to input from the user into our game right now with just this one line of code. So that's why we want to use input managers. So if we decided we want to change anything in the future, we can very easily change this. Okay, so I'm just going to delete this here and save my script again. So we're right back to where we are. I didn't actually change anything here. In this video, I'm going to give you an assignment to try on your own. Now this one's going to be a bit more complicated than the ones we tried in the past because this one involves multiple steps. And there are a few things you're going to have to attempt on your own here. Now I want to stress before you actually start trying it, this isn't something that you have to be able to do on your own at this point. So if you struggle at all or you're not able to figure it out or it doesn't work right, don't feel like you got it wrong. So I want to try to give you some assignments like that to get you in that habit and practice for it. But if you're struggling with it, as I said, that's completely fine and normal. You're not doing poorly, you're not doing wrong at this. Just follow along with what I do and you can always come back and try it again on your own later. Okay, so for this assignment, I want you to try making a jump for our player. And I'm going to give you a few tips and pointers to guide you through doing it because you haven't done all of this on your own yet. But the concepts needed, we've already covered. The first thing you would need to do is you need an if statement, and you're going to need to check if something's happening to make the player jump. So we showed how to use Input.GetAccess as well as Input.GetButton and the different types of getButton that you can use. So you're going to want to use one of those with that jump string that's in the input manager. Now the other thing we're going to need is we're going to need a variable that's going to store how much you want to jump. So again, we've done this already for the movement speed for our player. So you can do pretty much exactly what's there, but the number is going to change. And then once you have that number, we have to assign that to the velocity of the y value for our player. So remember, when we're moving left to right, that's the velocity of our player's x. X is the left to right, y is up and down, which is basically gravity. So you need to add something to that y on the rigid body. Okay, so give that a go and I will see you in the next video. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to make this jump now. I hope you gave that a try in the last video, and even if you didn't get it working, you at least learned something from it. But I'm going to show you how I'm going to implement it here. So let's go into our player controller. Now the first thing I'm just going to do here is I'm going to do an if statement. And as I mentioned, I'm going to use Input.GetButton down. So now the reason I'm choosing down here is because I only want to check once for the jump. If we use getButton, every time we press that button, and even if you only tap it very quickly, you're going to hit it on multiple frames. So it's going to run more than once. We only want this code to run one time when we tap the button. Now inside getButton, if we go back to Edit, Project Settings, and then Input Manager, we already have one here called Jump, and that's what we want to use. So this is going to work with the space key, and then it's also going to work with joystick button 3. Okay, so I need to put it in quotes because it's a string and we need to make sure it's spelled exactly. And now I'm just going to make sure this is working. So I'm going to do debug.log jumped. Okay, now when we run our game, I press space. And every time I press space, it's displaying jumped. And even if I hold it down, it's only showing once. Okay, and then on my gamepad, it's also working as well. So now let's go back in our code. Now we have to make it actually do something. So now we need to add a value to determine how much we're going to jump. So I'm going to do float. I'm going to do, since this one's not really a speed, it's how much you're going to jump. I'm going to call it jump force. Now this is a little bit misleading because we're not actually applying a force. We're just going to use the velocity, but I think the name makes more sense. Now I'm not even going to set it in the code here like we did here with the 5. I'm just going to put the serialized field. Remember, this is going to make it show up inside our Unity inspector. So I'm just going to go back here and now I'm going to set the jump force. I don't know how this is going to react. So I'm going to start it with 5. Okay, so we have a force now, but we have to apply it. Now we already applied a velocity to our player's X and Y, we applied a velocity to our player's X to move left and right by doing this. Now we could do something similar inside of jump. So I'm just going to copy this line of code. I'm going to paste it in here. So this is going to be basically the opposite of when we're moving left to right. So we don't want to check the X input and we don't want to multiply it by move speed because we don't want to change anything that's already happening on the player's X. Just like on this line here, we didn't want to change anything about the Y value. So with how we put the rigid body velocity.y in here, I mentioned that means it's taking the current velocity on the Y and putting it right back, which means no change. So if this player is standing on the ground and velocity.y is 0, it's still going to be 0. But if he's falling off a ledge and he's dropping, say it's -5, it's still going to be -5, but we're only going to change the left and right. Now in here, we're going to do the exact opposite. So we're going to take out the X part, and in here we're going to put my rigid body.velocity.x, So we're telling it, keep doing whatever you're doing on the X, but on the Y, this is where I want to apply the jump. So we need to put this jump force in. Okay, so this line of code should add a jump when we press the button that's assigned to jump. So let's go try this out. Let's run our game. Now I'm going to press space. Okay, and I'm jumping. If I hold space, I don't jump multiple times. I only jump once, and then if I press it on my controller, same thing. So I can move and we can jump. We can't jump enough to get up. And if we press to the side still, we stick to the wall. That's something different. We're going to fix that later. But we can at least move and jump. And then we can tweak the jump value. Now, one thing to note with this, you can jump as many times as you want. So you are only going to jump when you press space. But there's nothing telling the player that he can't jump anytime he wants, even if he's up in the air. So that's something we're going to have to fix later. Okay, so you can tweak the jump force to how you want it for your game. So find a setting that works for you. And that's it for this video. I will see you in the next one.